I'm very excited to be introducing Justin Spring tonight. He's the author of 2 previous books, Fairfield Porter, A Life in Art, and Secret Historian, The Life and Times of Samuel Steward, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. He's also received a Guggenheim Fellowship in General Nonfiction and a Leon Levy Center Fellowship in Biography for his independent and interdisciplinary work. He's here tonight to discuss his new book, The Gourmand's Way, 6 Americans in Paris and the Birth of a New Gastronomy. It's a compelling and often surprising portrait of the colorful and dynamic group of American writers who helped popularize French food and wine in the United States. The well-known chefs Richard Olney and Julia Child, the wine expert Alexis Lichine, food and travel writer M.F.K. Fisher, New Yorker writer A.J. Liebling, and the inimitable Alice B. Toklas. Kirkus Reviews wrote of the book that it's stunning, a thoroughly researched account of how Americans fell in and out of love with French cuisine and cooking, a literary meal both luscious and lively, and essential to understanding our vacillating love affair with French food. Please join me in welcoming Justin Spring.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Emily. Can everybody hear? Okay, good. Well, I'd like, first of all, to thank you all for coming tonight. I know it's a busy shopping time of the year and everybody's running around. But I also wanted to especially thank my family and friends here in DC who have given me such a lovely, warm reception yesterday and today. It's not often I get to see my brother and sister-in-law who lived right up the street in Bethesda. But by publishing a book every 8 or 9 years, I seem to get down to politics and prose. And I remember very clearly the last time I came down here. We also had a magnificent feast about 20 minutes before I was supposed to speak, and I was a little worse the wear for it. So tonight I'm perfectly ready to give you a little tour of Paris in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. One of the delights of working on this book is that it describes times that are a bit happier than our own. And the people who are in it are people of such substance and such intelligence and wit that I felt for the past 8 or 9 years as I was researching this book as if I was in the best possible company. Not least because I am a great amateur and home cook. I've published a cookbook, so I know a little bit of the trials and travails of working in the kitchen. I entertain a lot as well, and I worked for many years in and around book publishing. So the book is as much about writers publishing their books and breaking into print as it is about the excitement of traveling overseas to Paris in the years just after World War II and learning and taking pleasure in French food and wine. I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of the book, just because it's a sort of innovative group biography. And then I'm going to read 3 different sections from the book. Hopefully we have time for all 3, in which I discuss 3 of my favorite people in the book: Richard Olney, Julia Child, and Alice Toklas. So just to start out with, I have to say that in taking on this project of writing about 6 really idiosyncratic and wonderful authors, I was not necessarily writing about a group that was enormously coherent during their early years in Paris. It's a bit like when you go to college and you see people across a room the first semester and you don't know them, and then by the end of 4 years you know them all too well and have some very distinct opinions about them. This happens with the Gourmands in my book. They all come on under their own steam and for different reasons to Paris, and by the late 1960s they really have a lot of strong opinions about each other, which means the book has a very powerful and very tight ending. But the book is also about Paris, about the transformative experience of going to Paris or going to Europe as a young person and having your mind sort of blown open by all of the great things that Europe has to offer us, and that Paris in particular has to offer us, not just food and wine, but culture, cultural difference, different languages, different customs, different ways of viewing the world. So the book is as much about the disjunction between the American way of doing things and of thinking and the French and the Parisian specifically. The book looks a lot at French gastronomic literature of the 19th and 20th century, and I think it's the first study of American gastronomic writers that really sees the very close connection to French gastronomic literature and makes those connections very pointedly. So many people were blown away by Julia Child in the 1960s and 70s with her French Chef cooking show that they came to consider her cooking the sort of be-all and end-all of French cooking. And it gave all of us this wonderful entree into that world. But the truth of the matter is, she touched the very, very tip of what is an enormous iceberg. French cuisine has been a subject of intense scrutiny and conversation in French civilization for the past 300 or 400 years at least, since the days of Vatel specifically, the great cook Vatel. But in the 19th and 20th century, as dining became a more public and more social activity, the dialogue surrounding food, wine, and the way that meals were prepared and served became much more excited and much more interesting in magazines, journals, books. So that just gives you a general sense of how I approach the subject, not as a celebrity biography or a celebrity group biography, but rather using the 6 people in this study who were in Paris during different very significant moments in French cultural history and social history and political history, to look not only at the way in which Americans came to understand and appreciate a better way of eating and a better way of drinking, but also to look at the way in which American culture and French culture clashes and comes together in what I think of as a kind of a love affair. You have to remember that with the end of World War II, France had been put on its knees not once but twice by major wars taking place in its country, bankrupting the country. With the end of World War II, as these young Americans came over to experience and learn all about European culture, having been kept from it during the Great Depression and also World War II, they were encountering French who were desperate to revive their economy and restore not only their fine dining traditions, which had been put into eclipse by the massive food rationing and shortages in France during World War II, as the Germans took most of the food away from France in order to feed their war machine. But also, they needed to revive the luxury products that they are so famous for. Of course, their fine wines, but also their artisanal and gourmet products. So it's their services industry, hotels and restaurants, that they're eager to share with the Americans, but also it's the revival of trade. You have to remember also that because of the devastation that took place during World War II, the major markets that had been buying French luxury products during the period up to, I'd say, the Great Depression, were pretty much out of the running. But Britain was bankrupt, Germany was in a shambles, Russia had gone communist. All of these were major markets for fine wine, certainly, Bordeaux in particular. But all of the great parties that had been held during the Belle Epoque in Paris, these great dining experiences, which were so lovingly described in so many novels and plays, had really gone underground. And even French cooking tradition seemed imperiled by the end of World War II. A whole generation of cooks who should have been in the kitchen learning and practicing their art had been unable to, because things like butter and cream were simply not even available to the Germans during the later part of World War II in Paris. And certainly the French were not capable of going to restaurants or spending the kind of money that was required for these luxury products that had to be purchased on the black market. So with this amazing love affair that begins, we have Americans who are now the most powerful nation on the planet, also some of the most wealthy, and we have the French who have centuries of tradition and culture and ability in the kitchen and also in the vineyard, meeting together, and it's a love affair born of necessity, but also out of goodwill, because the French were, however many of the French had been part of the Communist Party or had allied themselves with the Nazis during World War II under the Pétain regime, were extremely happy to have their country liberated and for their government to start over. So Americans had helped in the liberation of France. The Allies together and the Free French had come into Paris. And the first chapter of my book, in fact, follows the war reporter, A.J. Liebling, who wrote for The New Yorker all through World War II, as he rides in a jeep from Normandy and the landing beaches all the way to Paris to have his first meal at the Closerie des Lilas, the famous cafe where Hemingway and so many of the lost generation had enjoyed their evenings together. So I'll just quickly describe the 6 people in the book. I know we all know who Julia Child is, and we all probably remember M.F.K. Fisher as well because of her remarkable fiction relating to the relationship between food, drink, and the soul, and the life of the emotions. Many of us may have forgotten Alexis Lichine, however, who was one of the great wine importers of the 1950s and 60s, a man who learned his trade in the 1930s, just after the end of Prohibition, and who then joined the military, where he ended the war as the aide-de-camp for General Eisenhower in Cap d'Antibes. So his job was to secure the best wines in France for the top brass, and also to arrange the best dinners. He came out of that extraordinary position in the army, very well placed among American, not just American top brass and top government officials, but also among some of the wealthiest people in the United States. And it was on the basis of these social connections that he was able to finance his early investments, both as a wine merchant and as a vineyard owner in Bordeaux and Burgundy. He would write a book called Wines of France, which would really set the tone for American wine buying all through the 1950s and 60s. Along with Lachine and Liebling, the war reporter, who was also a sort of ace humorist and food writer and sports writer, we have Richard Olney, who came to Paris as a young artist and painter in 1953, and who transformed during the course of a decade into a man who was obsessed with French food and wine, as well as with French culture. So he's quite different from the others in that he never set out to be a writer or to be a cook. He came to Paris to be a painter. One of his best friends was James Baldwin. He was part of a social circle that would at first dine out quite a bit, but then dine at home. And it was through throwing these endless entertainments and dinner parties that he launched himself as first as a home cook, and then as an American writing in French for the French about French food and wine, which is itself a very extraordinary thing. The French are quite snobbish about their wine, and they keep it closely as a closely held cultural treasure. So the idea that an American would have anything to say to the French or to add to the French dialogue on French cuisine came as a great surprise to the French, and in some instances it was a great amusement to them as well. But through his love of French language and culture, Olney was able to find his way into the French heart. And it was only much later that he would begin to write about French cuisine for American readers. Finally, the last person in the study is Alice Toklas. And just to quickly tell you a little bit about her, or to refresh your memories, I should say, Alice Toklas was the partner of Gertrude Stein, the writer, and she had come to Paris in 1907 from San Francisco. She fell in love with Gertrude Stein in 1907, and the two began living together, at first with Stein's brother Leo at the Rue de Fleurus atelier. Then over the course of the next 30 years, Stein and Toklas lived together without Leo Stein. They kept a house in the country as well as a place in the city, or the city of Paris. And eventually they moved from the Rue de Fleurus atelier to an apartment on the Rue Christine, really in the center of the left bank. And after Stein died unexpectedly in 1946, having survived World War II in France in the most amazing circumstances, Toklas was sort of left high and dry. The terms of the will that Stein had left behind left open to question how much money she was to have as an allowance. And although she had the use of the apartment which they rented together and the art collection which Stein had assembled and left in her will to Toklas for the course of her life, the art collection was not hers to sell, and she didn't have much in the way of capital. It was left instead to her nephew, Alan, and legal problems began almost immediately from the time of Stein's death. So she lived in precarious social circumstances, and because of that, the cookbook that she wrote was actually a way that she thought of earning enough money to keep herself fed and warm in the cold Parisian winters, at a time when fuel was quite expensive. So I'm going to read three little sections from the book. The first will be about Richard Olney, because most of us don't really know much about his life. And his life on the left bank of Paris is sort of emblematic of the kind of living that many young bohemians who came to Paris in the early 1950s took up. And I am beginning his story in 1953 after he decides to move in with his lover, a film critic and film writer named Elliot Stein. Olney took a small room at the place Elliot Stein lived, the Hôtel de Verneuil, at the corner of the Rue de Verneuil and the Rue de Beaune, which, though just a block or so from Julia and Paul Child's favorite luxury hotel, the Pond Royale, was an establishment of a very different sort, inhabited, quote, mostly by a down-and-out international lot of artists, unquote. It featured a ground floor room set aside for hourly rental to prostitutes. The place, neither comfortable nor clean, had only a single squat john, or hole in the floor, furnished with torn-up newspapers and a violent flushing system, which encouraged one to stand outside the entrance before pulling the chain. And while some rooms had a cold water sink, none had a bath or shower. Instead, residents were referred to les bains douches municipaux. Bed linens, likewise, were changed just once a month. The poky little rooms were really only for sleeping, reading, or making love. All other socializing took place instead at the many bars, cafes, and restaurants of the quartier. But at 60 cents a day, the rates could hardly be bettered. For a young man raised on the simplest possible cooking, Olney was from a farm town in Iowa, western Iowa, and entirely without knowledge of wine or spirits, Olney found Paris a wonderland of taste sensations. Being both curious and practical, he would chat with proprietors, waiters, and chefs about how they cooked, what they cooked, where they acquired their provisions, and how they organized their kitchens. Within his first few years in Paris, he too was planning, preparing, and serving good French home-cooked meals, and in certain rare instances doing so, informally, at the request of friends, for small amounts of money. However, wine rather than food became Olney's primary fascination and delight. Even though most of his American friends preferred whiskey, and he too would enjoy it in quantity throughout his life, he was intrigued by the variety of wines available in France. The French seemed to him to have a wine to suit every possible mood, hour, and dining experience. There was nothing like it back in Iowa. In learning how and why the French drank their wine, he came to understand it as an element of daily life, not, as Americans might have thought, as a means to inebriation, but rather as an indispensable and elemental component of every meal, like bread. Wine was relaxing, true, and even inebriating, but the French considered it nutritionally rich, a digestive aid, and generally good for one's health, not simply a means towards intoxication. At nearly every restaurant he went to, Olney saw French diners pondering their wine lists as carefully as their menus, consulting thoughtfully with waiters or wine captains about which wine, winemaker, and vintage might suit their meal and budget best. Slowly he learned how to appreciate wine to the fullest, how to examine its color, to swirl it in the glass to release its bouquet, to sniff, sip, suck, and even chew it before swallowing as a way to obtain the full range of taste from start to finish. The many varieties of wine, and the many ways in which the wines were made, aged, bottled, marketed, and consumed, all these subjects interested him. So did the lore surrounding wines. He pursued this interest through reading, studying, and discussing wine at length with people who shared his enthusiasm, and such people were not hard to find in Paris. With this most pleasant form of self-education, he started to taste wines extensively, both on their own and with food. Along with various outings to vineyards, he made a point of tasting yearly with the winemakers at Paris' Salon des Arts Ménagers. Julia Child also attended every year, describing it to her friend Avis Devoto as a tremendous exposition or fair of household appliances and wine tasting held in the Grand Palais, with everybody deliriously happy because one can always refresh oneself with a bit of wine tasting. One winemaker Olney met in 1953, Lucien Perraud of Domaine Tempier in Bandol, would become a lifelong friend. Teaching himself about French wines was by no means an inexpensive pastime, but thanks to living in Paris at a time when the exchange rate was very good, and also thanks to his skills in the kitchen, Olney was able to do so far more economically than most. Okay, so we have Richard Olney starting out. Most of you know a little bit about the story of Julia Child and how she wrote or co-wrote, I should say, the book Mastering the Art of French Cooking, with two women, Louisette Bertholle and Simone Beck. These two French ladies had been working on a book for a good year or so before meeting Julia, and upon meeting her, they began to think that she might be the key ingredient that was missing to the draft of the manuscript that they had in hand. They'd already been told by a good friend and advisor back in New York that they needed to find an American who could explain things in American to the Americans. But the way in which Bertholle and Beck and Child came together to work on mastering the art of French cooking is really a social story as well as a story of literary ambitions. The three women were introduced in pretty fancy and high social circles in Paris, and during the course of their getting to know one another, Beck and Bertholle invited Child to attend a gourmet club that they were both members of, called Le Cercle des Gourmettes, which was a very fancy ladies' club that had been in operation for a good 20 years. It had shut down during the war, of course, but through it, women of a very good background and class and strong social connections were able to meet and discuss the way in which food was prepared and served in the home. So although Julia Child had been studying at the Cordon Bleu, she'd been studying at what we would describe as a sort of fancy restaurant cooking there. It was when she joins the Cercle des Gourmettes that she becomes more aware of how the French are cooking in their homes, particularly people of a certain comfortable station in life. So I'm going to read a bit about the friendship between between Simone Beck and Julia Child here, and about how they came to know each other. At the time they met, Beck was the brigadier and chef of Le Cercle des Gourmettes, in essence, its driving force. One of the youngest and liveliest women in this social club, she was a person of extraordinary good looks, style, and vigor. She was also a self-described frenetic perfectionist, having inherited this trait from her mother. As a girl, she had enjoyed helping her families cook in their Norman kitchen, occasionally preparing desserts or entire meals. Now, in her early 40s, she was a highly experienced Parisian hostess who entertained regularly both in town and in country, and had strong thoughts on how to do so, many of which came from her father, an Anglophilic Frenchman of starchy late Victorian manners and ideas. Beck's Norman manor house background, her Parisian studies with Pelleprat at the Cordon Bleu, and her married life, first in the 16th arrondissement and subsequently in posh suburban Neuilly, had all taught Beck that there were very specific and correct ways of extending invitations, organizing menus, setting tables, and receiving guests. In addition, Beck had been working for some time now with another club member, Louisette Bertholle, on developing a French home cooking cookbook for Americans, basing it, as she later recalled, on my mother's black recipe notebooks and our cook Zolma's Cuisine, and tips from chefs in restaurants, and from the catering chefs who worked with us at the Cercle des Gourmettes. Louisette Bertholle, who Paul Child thought a perfect Frenchwoman, knew America and Americans far better than Beck because her husband worked for an American chemical company, and she had recently spent several years living in the United States. The two women had already produced 2 small prototypes of the book in booklet form. Their manuscript in progress, meanwhile, featured more than 100 detailed recipes. Of these two women, Julia Child was the most drawn to Beck. Of these two women, Julia Child was most drawn to Beck, perhaps seeing in this tall, handsome woman a French version of herself. Both were strong-minded and energetic, and cooking was their shared passion. Both were also childless, and so, unlike Bertholle, who was often distracted by child-rearing, could give their full and undivided attention to their work in French cuisine. According to Child's biographer, each called the other une force de la nature, and Julia also called Simca la super française. But there were differences, too. Beck was an immensely proper and formal person for whom correct manners and polite interactions were always of greatest importance. Child's American habit of clowning, teasing, and poking fun at people was not something in which Beck easily took part. Rather, she believed in good manners always. Similarly, when Beck had guests to dinner in her home, everything needed to be absolutely appropriate to the occasion, not merely the menu, but the wines, the table settings, the seating arrangements, and even the guests. In Beck's words, for a dinner très fin, a private dinner, the point is to bring together people who are intellectually compatible, on the same social rung, and who share the same way of life and religion, she once explained. The same social rung I must insist on. In France, it's most important of all. Money doesn't count. It's breeding that does. Intellect, too. The people who came together at Beck's table needed not only to share the same basic social background and way of life, but also the same core beliefs. You'll never find a communist in my house, she told the same reporter. You can mix people from the same milieu, but putting a gardener in with an artist, a paysan with a minister, ça va pas du tout. That means that won't work at all. The barbecue where everything joins together and has where everyone joins together and has a good time, that has nothing to do with France. The melting pot works in the United States, but not in this country. Now, ideas about keeping to one's own class were not unknown to Julia Child. She had grown up in Pasadena in a restrictive country club setting with a father who was a member of the John Birch Society. But as an adult, she had rebelled against such closed-mindedness and prided herself on being able to mix with just about anyone. And as the wife of a low-level government employee, doing so had now become, to some extent, her job. But it was also something she felt simply to be right and just, and something she even enjoyed, for she disliked social pretense. She would later recall that as a young woman, quote, I was always careful to tell my Aunt Theodora when she was boasting about her socially illustrious antecedents that John Alden and Priscilla Mullins were indentured servants. Through her marriage to Paul Child, who, though he came from a society background and had grown up without money and had chosen the path of the self-styled artist intellectual, Julia had become even more liberal. In that way, she was clearly the opposite of Beck and the other gourmets. Even though Child's background was unmistakably wealthy, socially exclusive, and privileged, and even though her own manners, bearing, and accent were undeniably patrician, her newfound ambition was really just the opposite: to create a cooking school, a cookbook, and in time, a television cooking program that would enable anyone from any background to have easy access to knowledge, and through that knowledge and a bit of hard work, access to fine French food. In attending Le Cordon Bleu, Child had focused on restaurant-style cooking techniques, but now through the gourmets, and specifically through Simone Beck, she was coming into direct contact with something altogether different: upper-class French customs, preferences, and prejudices regarding the table. As a result, she was compelled to face a central paradox regarding her own interest in fine French cooking and fine French dining, namely, that the kind of French cuisine she had been enjoying, with its emphasis on luxury ingredients and labor-intensive preparations, was undeniably classist and exclusionary. While Child loved haute cuisine, she felt that preparing and eating delicious food ought to be within everyone's grasp, not simply a privilege of the very wealthy. And so as she slowly got to know Beck and Berthold, she began to realize that what she really wanted to do was democratize and demystify French cuisine for Americans, something neither of the other two women had ever foreseen as part of their project, and that neither could quite comprehend, not least because both relied daily on their cooks to run their kitchens. Okay, so there's Julia for us. I should add that this book is going to make you very hungry if you read it. I haven't focused on any of the food descriptions in the book, but I should just add this last paragraph, which I think is very sweet. In later years, Avis Devoto would describe Fischbacher and Child's joint work on this project, which grew into Mastering the Art of French Cooking, as one of the great collaborations of history. The two women are absolutely necessary to each other, and it is the combination of the two which makes their work together so revolutionary. But this gifted and far more analytic and precise American cook and recipe writer, But this collaboration was not simply one of a gifted French cook and an equally gifted and far more analytic and precise American cook and recipe writer. It was also to be, although no one yet realized it, the collaboration of a privileged Parisian gentlewoman with an American self-described upper bohemian whose secret, Promethean ambition was to demystify grand French upper-class cuisine and thereby deliver it, like the gift of fire, to the middle-class American home. Okay. There are many funny stories to tell about Alice Toklas, not least of which is the inclusion of a recipe for hashish fudge in her Alice B. Toklas cookbook, which launched a scandal, which then launched the book, which made it a bestseller during the 1950s. But I always say about this book that if you read it carefully, you will find it extremely moving, and it's moving in a very quiet way. The book is it describes a love affair between two women at a time when women were not allowed to describe such feelings or experiences. And although Gertrude Stein had arguably done it first when she wrote the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, published in 1933, Alice Toklas, moving toward the ends of her life, she was 73 when she wrote the cookbook, and looking back on the loss of a partner that she had loved more than anything in life, created a book that was not only a memory of their life together and an account also of the beautiful food that they'd enjoyed in their home and served to their friends, but it was also a response to the Alice B. Toklas cookbook, one that did not attempt in any way to compete with Gertrude Stein's delightful memoir, In the Voice of Alice B. Toklas, but instead to complement it from the kitchen. So the roles between the two ladies were pretty well defined. Gertrude Stein was the genius writer. Alice Toklas was the housekeeper, gardener, and cook. But what you see when you read the book very carefully is that apart from her great love of Gertrude Stein and her great love of Gertrude Stein's literary production, Toklas had a special love as well for the miracle of bringing fruits and vegetables from her garden to her table and then serving them to her friends. So this very primal activity of gardening and cooking, very basic domestic activity, had become extremely important to the two women, particularly during World War II, when they were cut off financially and also socially from their American connections and had to live pretty much by their wits in the French countryside at the little house, or not so little, the house that they had rented for the better part of 2 decades. So here I'm going to talk just a little bit about the last chapter of the Alice B. Toklas cookbook, which describes that garden. While most of Alice Toklas' working life had been devoted to supporting and nurturing Stein, the 2 vegetable gardens in Bilignin, they had rented a chateau in France in a little town called Bilignin, near a market town called Belley, which is a short drive from Geneva. The 2 vegetable gardens in Bilignin were her own vast creative endeavor, a multi-year enterprise in which Stein would often lend a hand, but over which Toklas had complete authority and into which she poured her heart and soul. The project began with the complete restoration of the chateau's 2 fruit and vegetable gardens in 1929. Since they were in a sorry state of neglect, a team of men were hired to do the clearing of the beds, the turning of the soil, and, most horrifying, the eradicating of a vast seething nest of snakes. After that, Toklas did as much planting and tending as she could, employing a young man from the little hamlet just outside the chateau's front gate to do the heavy work. Both vegetable gardens needed daily tending, for they were rife with accumulated weed seeds. Moreover, the chalky soil needed constant enrichment and watering. Quote, "The work in the vegetables was a full-time job and more," Toklas wrote. "Later it became a joke, Gertrude Stein asking me what I saw when I closed my eyes, and I answered weeds." But when the vegetables started to produce, all that hard work resulted in miracles. Here Toklas says, "The first gathering of the garden in May of salads, radishes, and herbs made me feel like a mother about her baby. How could anything so beautiful be mine?" Toklas wrote. And this emotion of wonder filled me for each vegetable as it was gathered every year. There is nothing that is comparable to it, as satisfactory or as thrilling, as gathering the vegetables one has grown. This sense of the miraculous had extended naturally enough into the chateau's vast, old-fashioned kitchen, and ultimately to the Stein-Toklas dinner table, which was distinguished by its elegant simplicity. "When the vegetables were ready to be picked, it never occurred to us to question what way to cook them," she wrote. Naturally the simplest, just to steam or boil them and serve them with the excellent country butter or cream that we had from a farmer almost within calling distance. Later still, when we had guests and the vegetables had lost the aura of a newborn miracle, sauces added variety. The chapter concludes with a number of favorite vegetable recipes and concludes with the observation that, after the sharing of all this homegrown produce with friends and guests, the greatest pleasure Toklas took in her garden was the final gathering in of vegetables at the very end of the growing season. And here I'll read aloud from this passage. She writes, "When autumn came, the last harvest was so occupying that one forgot that it meant leaving the garden for the return to Paris. The day the huge baskets were packed was my proudest in all the year. The cold sun would shine on the orange-colored carrots, the green, yellow, and white pumpkins and squash, the purple eggplants, and the last few red tomatoes. They made for me more poignant color than any post-impressionist picture. Merely to look at them made all the rest of the year's pleasure insignificant. Gertrude Stein took a more practical attitude. She came out into the denuded, wet, cold garden, and looking at the number of baskets and crates, asked if they were all being sent to Paris, that if they were, the freight costs would ruin us. She saw that there were enough vegetables for an institution and reminded me that our household consisted of 3 people. There was no question that, looking at that harvest as an economic question, it was disastrous, but from the point of view of the satisfaction which work and aesthetic confer, it was sublime. Toklas, writing all this in 1953, concludes the book with a vision of that long-lost garden on the final day of their tenancy, just before they were evicted, when in the middle of the war they were compelled to pack up, say goodbye forever to the Chateau of Lenin, and move to a gloomy house above Culoz nearby. She writes, "Our final, definite leaving of the gardens came one cold winter day, all too appropriate to our feelings and the state of the world. A sudden moment of sunshine peopled the gardens with all the friends and others who had passed through them. Ah, there would be another garden. The same friends possibly, or no, probably new ones. And there would be other stories to tell and to hear. And so we left billeted, And so we left billeted never to return." Toklas strikes a note of optimism in these understated lines. But contrary to her assertion, there would never be another garden before her. Still, the dream of having and maintaining a garden in the country remained with her to the end of her life. In one of her last letters, 2 months before her death, she wrote a friend, "I shall never have a garden again. I think and dream of one." So, thank you. Yeah, that passage always makes me cry. So, I think we have a little bit of time before we wrap up for the night. Does anyone have any questions for me about the structure of the book or about the individuals in the book? It's a very interesting question. I've actually read correspondence that goes on within the Gertrude Stein estate at the time that the movie comes out. The movie's not about Alice Toklas, and it's not about Gertrude Stein. It's a Peter Sellers comedy, which involves brownies that are made with hashish or pot. So there's a drug experience in it. I think that for those who grew up in the 50s, the hashish brownie recipe was one of these almost like an urban myth. Because when the hashish brownie recipe was published, it was only published in the English edition of the book. But the scandal that it set off across the nation was enormous, and it was the rush to go and get that recipe that drove people to the bookshops, where they discovered that Harper and Row had cut out the recipe out of fear of being sued or having the book destroyed. So there was a lot of discussion of the hashish fudge. Somehow over the years, though, Americans turned away from even the idea of that fudge, which is a fruit paste made with nuts and dried fruits and sugar and butter, and instead started putting their hashish into brownies. So there are a lot of people who think of Alice Toklas as the creator of the Alice Toklas brownie, but that's not the case. She was not a brownie maker. She was a hashish fudge maker. And I have sampled versions of this hashish fudge. I'm thinking of having a contest for people who are interested in trying to. The hashish fudge confection was in fact donated, the recipe for it was donated by the artist, surrealist artist Brian Geisen, who was good friends with Paul and Jane Bowles, and at the time was living in Morocco. He was in close correspondence with Toklas because they'd met in the years before World War II and met again in the late 40s and early 50s in Paris. When she was trying to put together the last chapters of her book, she needed more material, and so she called all of her friends and said, "Please send me a recipe, I need a recipe." She hadn't looked at the head note too carefully, so she just typed it up and sent it off. Both the head note and the recipe suggested that she was very cognizant of hashish, marijuana, cannabis sativa, cannabis indica, things that people who are into pot and hashish know all about. But the whole head note and the recipe came instead from North Africa, where, of course, that is a daily ingestion of hashish was sort of part of life for the Bowles set. And Brian Geisen at the time was, in fact, running a small restaurant that was famous both for its music and for the free consumption of hashish in and around the tables. So the whole question of Alice Toklas and her involvement with drug use makes up a series of really fun anecdotes in the book, but it doesn't have that much to do with the movie that you asked about. Anybody else? Well, the world is catching up with Alice Toklas, isn't it? both in Colorado and in California, cooking with the hashish or with marijuana, cannabis, hash oil, all these things, THC, it's all becoming part of the general culture. There's actually a television show called Bong Appetit on a channel called the Viceland channel, I think it's called. And I actually looked at it at the suggestion of a friend to see if they would maybe make a hashish fudge a la Alice Toklas. But they're far more advanced, and they're doing multi-course banquets with everything spiked with hashish. So I don't think I'd fit in there. Sure. Well, I think one of the earliest and most, there are court pastry chefs and cooks like Vatel, and that goes back to the days of Louis XIV. So the anecdote told by Madame de Sévigné to her daughter about Vatel's suicide when his delivery of fish didn't arrive on time, that's in the book. But so there is a kind of dialogue about gastronomy going on in court correspondence and in official histories. But it's really only after the overthrow of the Ancien Regime and the turning out into the streets of the great cooks, of the great monarchs and aristocrats who have to find a new way of making a living, that restaurant doors open and the public enjoyment and consumption and discussion of fine cooking becomes part of the public dialogue. Just as the Louvre opened its doors in the early part of the 19th century, and everyday writers and intellectuals could now see paintings that before that were only for the very rich to enjoy, so too the dining rooms of the aristocrats now became the public dining rooms of those people lucky enough to live in Paris or to be visiting Paris. So to look at the earliest, I suppose the big literature, the major person before Escoffier is Carême. He wrote multi-volume treatises on how to cook for the nobility and for great houses. There are there's an aristocrat named Grimaud de la Reynière who wrote something called the Almanach de Gourmand, which he serially published, and it was all about how to eat and drink well in Paris seasonally. So that's in something like, I think, 18 volumes, and they're tiny little books. Richard Olney collected them, in fact, later in life, and Julia Child was a great Grimaud de la Reynière fan, in part because he was a moneyed playboy who liked to have dinner parties that had a kind of louche aspect to them, and he was sort of like a rock star, behaving badly at the table, but also very discriminating about what was good and what was not good, and how to serve it, and how to have a dinner party. Of course, there's Brillat Savarin, and I talk about his book, The Physiology of Taste, in relation to M.F.K. Fisher's translation of it, which he undertook in the mid-1940s. I think the most interesting and most important of all of these writers is Escoffier, who was the great codifier of French haute cuisine, created for restaurant service. So instead of cooking everything buffet style or catering style, as you said, like you would have everything served all at once, cooking is now done à la minute. And in order to serve and prepare many, many different meals of different sorts all in one kitchen, you have to have a very rigorous sort of set of sauces and described preparation modes that streamlines that process and keeps the chaos in the kitchen to a minimum. So Escoffier is the person who brings us right up into the 1930s. He wrote his last book, which is called Ma Cuisine. Escoffier's Guide Culinaire was the guide for all people cooking in restaurants in France. But Ma Cuisine was a refinement upon that sort of substantial professional cooking manual, which was designed for the home cook and working within a budget. And so Escoffier's Ma Cuisine is one very important work. Also published around the same time, just a little bit later, is the Larousse Gastronomique by Montagnier and Salas. And that was a major textbook that Julia was given by Paul Child shortly after they arrived in Paris. I talk about Evelyn Ebrard's La Cuisine de Madame Saint-Ange. It's the great early cookbook published by a woman in the 20th century in France. There's also a fantastic cookbook, which is quite humorous, called Ali Bab's, or Gastronomie Pratique by Ali Bab, which was the pseudonym of a man named Henry Babinski. And then there's Prosper Montagnet's Le Grand Livre de Cuisine as well. These are all major cookbooks that no American seems to know about, in part because French cooking is French cooking. It's really stayed over there. Americans have their own literature of cooking and literature designed for the more modest, I'd say, home cook. French are a little bit more excited about taking time in the kitchen and getting involved in more time-consuming preparations and more elaborate preparations. So, sure. Yeah, actually, what I never quite have time to do when I give a presentation about this book is to talk about, there's a sort of second tier of really busy activity going on in the United States, as these 6 writers are off in France learning and accumulating knowledge and then bringing excitement and knowledge back to the USA. Beginning even before World War II, there were economic refugees coming from France or from Europe to the USA and enlisting as French cooks in American kitchens, particularly hotel kitchens. But during World War II, there were some very important people who arrived from overseas. The one that stands out for most people is Henri Soulet, who opened the very famous restaurant Le Pavillon, which was based on a restaurant that had come over to the 1939 World's Fair. It was Le Pavillon de France at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, held out in Flushing. And 39, of course, was the year that war was declared. The contract for the workers at Le Pavillon, who included the chef Pierre Franet, who was then a young man, the contract for the French workers at Le Pavillon extended into 1940. So with the invasion of France by the Germans in May of 1940, these men were basically stateless. They had no place to go home to unless they wanted to become part of Pétain's France, living under the Nazis. And many of them chose not to. Henri Soulet encouraged them not to. They were stateless, and so what he had to do was put everybody on a bus and take them up to Canada and then walk them across the border so that after war had been declared, they could be declared war refugees. Shortly thereafter, Soulet opened Le Pavillon restaurant in New York, which quickly became the most important French restaurant in America. The other economic refugee, and also refugee from wartime, who came to New York during this period is the inimitable Diony Lucas, who had studied under Pelleprat at the Cordon Bleu, and then opened a branch of the Cordon Bleu in London in the years before the war. So if you know London, she had a beautiful cooking school and restaurant just off of Sloane Square in South Kensington. And then during the Blitz, during the Blitz, that area of London was very heavily bombed because of the railway lines running through there. She had 2 young boys, and she decided that she would part with her partner, Rosemary Sloan, and instead move to New York City with them to make sure the boys were kept safe, but also to open a cooking school and restaurant along the same lines, making it the Cordon Bleu restaurant and cooking school on 60th Street, just off of Lexington Avenue. So she was the sort of doyenne of French cooking before we had Julia Child and before Alice Toklas published her book. She taught an entire generation of debutantes and rich women in New York City. She also was a mentor to people like Paula Wolfert, who went on to become great cooks. She was very in close competition, I should say, with James Beard, who was establishing his name as the leading culinary figure in America at that time. They also have writers like Joseph Wexberg, a Czech refugee, writing on French cuisine and American cuisine, and writing memoirs of his life in France that often have food and wine as a focus. So even as the Americans are in France gathering all this information from the French, we also have a whole group of French or European people in the United States establishing the importance of French food to American culture at a time when Americans are extremely eager to go back to Europe because they've been denied it by the Great Depression and then also by World War II. The third, and I'd say most high-profile figure of the 3 that I talked about is a man named Claudius Philippe, also known as Philippe of the Waldorf. He had come across to the United States in 1933. His father was a chef in London. He was from a French family. His family was from the Savoy. But he had been raised first in London, and then he'd done a little bit of education over in Paris, but he went to work for the Waldorf Astoria just at the time of its opening, and he apprenticed under Oscar of the Waldorf. Do you remember Oscar's restaurant in the Waldorf? Oscar's restaurant is named after Oscar Turkey, known as Oscar of the Waldorf, who was really the grand poobah of the Waldorf Astoria during the 1930s into the early 1940s. When Oscar retired, Philippe became the new Oscar of the Waldorf. He became Philippe of the Waldorf, and he was in charge of all of the food and wine being served at that hotel. The hotel had 6 dining rooms, restaurants galore. You've all probably been there or heard about it. Had very famous parties that were very high profile. Elsa Maxwell was helping to throw the parties. She was a very good friend of his. And so as a result of all of this intense Frenchification of American dining, Philippe was actually promoting not only French wines and French food, but French cultural history. So when he had his famous April in Paris charity balls at the Waldorf on a yearly basis, they were all based on French themes like, the French Revolution, the life of Balzac, things like that. So, and many of the leading young debutantes were at these parties. We have photographs, of course, of Jackie Kennedy as a young woman, just decked out in one Paris gown after another, attending these. Also, film stars. And it was a place where there was a great deal of writing and broadcasting going on that would sort of take all that information out into the smaller cities all across America and get Americans excited about French food and wine. Philippe of the Waldorf was also the mentor and best friend of Alexis Lichine. So even as we have Philippe of the Waldorf promoting French consciousness through all of the parties and grand affairs that he's hosting at the Waldorf Astoria, we have Alexis Lachine stocking the Waldorf Astoria's wine cellars, and we also have him going out to all of these cities across America and helping average Americans to learn about wine, build wine cellars, and then stock and lay down wines in their wine cellars so that they too can live like the French. So there's many, many different aspects of this story. It's really not just about these 6 people, but they're the six I'd say who are the most charismatic and the most interesting to follow as I tell the story of French cuisine and American love and appreciation of it. Other questions? Or, okay.
What do you think about French, how the state of French food and gastronomy is today, and what these 6 would think about the food today? Because it's a lot of controversy in France, I think, and then American, and how it's stayed in America, how it's still here.
I think that, well, the period that I talk about in French history is now referred to among the French as Les 30 Glorieuses. It's the 30 glorious years during which the French economy exploded in the best possible way. It bounced back from 2 devastating world wars, rebuilt its economy, became the leading economic force in Europe for a while, and it also became a kind of the torchbearer for culture and for pleasure. There were a bunch of setbacks that happened around 1973 to 1975 that really cut back on American excitement about French food and wine. There's also political problems, starting in 1968 with the riots, which had a very strong anti-American edge to them. The Paris riots of 1968 were a student demonstration which became a unionist demonstration, but it was strongly communist, in many cases Maoist, and extremely anti-capitalist and anti-American. So the slogans being shouted and the hatred being expressed toward Americans during that period was enough to turn a lot of Americans off. But financially, there was the problem also. First, Nixon took the United States off the gold standard. He had to. But with the going off the gold standard, the relative value of the dollar to the franc really changed considerably. And the great bargains that this group of people that I write about in the book were able to appreciate and enjoy and experience were no longer available to most Americans. So I lived in France in 2009, for example, during that incredible economic meltdown that we had here. And I was quite worried about finances during that time. But what I experienced over there was the fact that unlike these 6 Americans, there was no financial advantage to having a dollar to spend versus the euro. In fact, the euro was at an all-time high, And I was living like your average Frenchman, which is to say not all that well. What I became very strongly aware of as a result of that experience was that Grande Cuisine is an intensely expensive and labor-intensive art form, or craft, I guess you'd call it, which is predicated on the diner having a huge amount of money to spend on the large amounts of labor that go into the preparation of the food, and also the artisanal nature of the foods and the wines being enjoyed. And then on top of that, you have the maintenance and upkeep of the historic interiors in which these meals are being presented, and of course the labor costs of having many, many people dance attendance on you in a restaurant. What the French are doing, and I think are doing very beautifully right now, is reinventing the restaurant experience, taking it even farther away. I'd actually talked during the course of the book about the way in which the excitement about French Grande Cuisine dissipates during the 1950s and 60s and ends in the mid-1970s with a new excitement about Mediterranean cuisine, Provençal cuisine, provincial cuisines generally, including Southwestern cuisine, but what are basically glorified peasant cuisines and home cooking. So Richard Olney is very central to that transition away from overly fancy, labor-intensive cooking, because he moves to a tiny little hut on a hillside in Provence where he has to really work very hard just to bring in, make the simplest meals. He has to build a fire. He has to walk a mile to the village. He has to struggle to grow a tomato. All these things make his life complicated and also make the enjoyment of food better for the large amount of work that goes into it. So in this case, though, what's happening today in France is there's a whole movement called bistronomie, which is a combination of gastronomic ambitions, but bistro price point. And what you have are incredibly talented young French chefs and cooks who are basically creating pop-up restaurants, putting paper down on the table. It's a little more crowded in the room. The same loving attention goes into the creation of the food, but the whole point is to make a really fine dinner available to a person for a moderate price so that the French can enjoy their own cuisine in their own restaurants. And I think one of the reasons that so many of us Americans get a sort of negative experience or negative impression of the Parisians is that the Parisians, they live in one of the most beautiful cities, if not the most beautiful city on the planet, but they also, they're subject to invasions of masses of tourists every year who vastly outnumber them and who have much more money to spend than they do. So if this happened in Washington, D.C., there would be riots in the streets. I think the French have learned to accommodate themselves to it because so much of their economy depends on catering to foreigners. But this new bistronomy movement is one that sort of lays out hope for the future for good eating and good dining experiences in restaurants in France that the average person can enjoy. And that's happening here in the USA today too, in places like Chicago, San Francisco definitely. And I was just in Philadelphia. The food up there was amazing. So if you know where to look for it, and if you're, that's it. Is that all?
That's about the end of our time, but
Okay,
thank
good.
you so much.
Sure, my pleasure.